Hello to you all. I hope everyone can hear me. That's my first time using this StreamYard, but I hope I'm audible and you can all hear and see me. Welcome to Skidmore's webinar series, and I'm Joseph Sermatore. I'm an associate professor of English here at the college. I focus on drama, theater, and performance studies, and the relationships of literature to philosophy and philology. And on campus this semester, I'm offering an English department seminar on public speech. We just hosted Samara Bay in our class yesterday after reading her writing for the past several weeks. After witnessing her interactions with our current Skidmore students from a wide range of academic disciplines, I know we're all in for a fantastic discussion this afternoon. So before we dive in, I just want to mention that there will be an opportunity for Q&A during this presentation. So please submit your questions via the submit button below, or maybe it's to the side. I'm not 100% sure how you're seeing it on your end. We'll have about 30 minutes of discussion between Samara and me. It'll be kind of like a fireside chat sort of conversation, pretty informal, about Samara's work and her recent book. And then we'll have about 20 more minutes of Q&A at the end of the session, where you can we'll turn to your questions. We'll hopefully try to segue to that second section of the presentation a little organically if we can. We'll do our best to try to get to as many questions as possible, but we probably won't be able to get to them all because we know that there's a lot of folks out there attending today. Also, just so you know, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll share it with all of you via email in the next couple of days. And before we invite Samara in, I also have to say thanks especially to the Office of Advancement and the Department of English for hosting this event, and to the Departments of Theater, Management and Business, the Department of Politics, the Program and Arts Administration, and the Periclean Honors Forum for co-sponsoring. And extra special thanks go to Carissa Miles, Jessica Cellini, and Teresa Penn for providing administrative and technical support all along the way. And of course, above all, thanks to all of you for taking time out of your Wednesdays to be here with us. So, without much more ado, it's my honor and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce you all to Samara Bay, who is the best-selling author of Permission to Speak from Penguin Random House 2023. She is a sought-after public speaking coach to rising leaders in all arenas. She's one of our nation's leading and most soulful change makers in the realm of how we show up in public, in private, in mediated form, and in all the gray areas in between. Her clients have included Rachel McAdams, Pierce Brosnan, Ricky Martin, Jennifer Jason Lee, Rosie O'Donnell. She's led workshops and keynotes globally, including with Google and Telemundo, MAC Cosmetics, South by Southwest, the Female Founders Collective, Warner Brothers Discovery, MoveOn.org, and many more. And her Substack featured publication, How to Show Up, offers weekly advice on authenticity, visibility, self-promotion, leadership, friendship, mischief, and how we can use our voices both to get what we want and change the world. So, Samara, welcome to Skidmore. It's so great to have you here.
That was the #1 greatest introduction I've ever gotten, and now I need to recover.
Y'all, we should just tell you this right up front. Samara and I are friends for many, many years. We go back to having been students at the Princeton University English department together. So go English. Princeton University, the second best college to study English at. I feel I can say that because our college president, Mark Connor, has his PhD from Princeton's English department. So, you know, it's a good school out there for studying English. But Samara and I go back to having been English students together. So it's an extra special pleasure to be able to introduce her to students in the English department at Skidmore and to all of you. Welcome, Samara.
Thank you. And thank you, all of you. Joe and I were talking beforehand that we wish we could see you all. We know there's a big group out there and that you're all around the country in all different ages. And we're just using our imagination as boldly as we can to imagine that we're all in a shared room together. And as you ask questions or, write anything in those comment section, do it with that spirit, right? Like, let's pretend we're in the space together and that, the thought that you have deserves to be shared, and we would love to hear it.
Definitely. We've got graduates ranging from the classes of 1964 to 2023 here with us. So it's a really wide-ranging crowd. So we're looking forward to your questions in the second half of the session. But first, Samara, start off by telling us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your background. We saw that one of the questions already submitted was, how did you become an expert on this topic? So what is your story? I'd love to hear your version of it. You tell a little bit of it in the book, but tell us now.
Yeah, there's obviously so many different versions. All of us could answer this question a lot of different ways. I teach people how to do this. So, I'm aware that there's a lot of origin stories, but I'll say this because I did not expect to write a book. I have this background as a dialect coach in Hollywood. I like to joke, but it's totally not a joke, that means I have a long history of telling movie stars what to do with their tongues. and as a result, I understand the minutia of speech, the vowels, the consonants, the musicality, but I was always doing something more interesting with my clients. There was always something about how we get thoughts from the inside, whether we've written them ourselves, whether someone else has written them for us, whether they are spontaneous, how to get those thoughts from the inside out. And especially if we're doing it in a different accent, but also if we're doing it when the stakes feel really high, if we're doing it in front of more people than we're used to. And so there was this natural progression, but it didn't feel natural at the time. It felt wild. In the summer of 2018, I got to coach Gal Gadot on Wonder Woman 2. I was in Washington, D.C. for a month on the other side of the country from my husband and child. I'm LA based. And I did this month. It was the one part of the movie that filmed in the US and then the rest went to Europe. And we did all these big outdoor DC scenes. Like we literally shut down Pennsylvania Avenue. It's wild. And lots of like flying sequences for anyone who's seen the movie, which meant there was actually not a lot for me to do on the sound front. And so I had all this downtime, and that was the summer, to bring us all back for a moment, when we were 2 years into our former president's term. We were hurtling really towards our first midterm of his term, the first chance to maybe change the narrative in the country. My activist friends were burning out. There was the pictures of the kids getting separated at the border. I mean, that was a wild, wild moment. And I say all that because in the midst of that, when I think all of us were feeling like there was not, we weren't doing enough. We didn't know what to do. I got this call from moveon.org, and a friend had put me up for it. And they asked out of the blue, would I be open to coaching first-time female candidates for office for the midterms? It's what ended up becoming the blue wave, but we didn't know that at the time, right? We just knew like something had to change. And I had never done this before, but I had a hunch that as I joked, I wasn't going to make them worse. And so I said yes. It was totally pro bono. In a way the stakes were very low, but in another way they were incredibly high. And I was thrown into all these Zoom sessions one-on-one with all these women who were running for office for the first time, and thus, like you and me, they were just citizens. They were just humans who had looked left and looked right and gone, oh God, maybe it's me. And then the question of how to become a public person ended up being a bigger question than any of them anticipated and knew what to do with. And I was witness during this era when I was coaching all these women, one by one over Zoom. I was witness to, first of all, how absolutely magnificent each one of them was. Different stories, different parts of the country, different offices they were running for. But every one of them was the type of leader we want in the world. And I was also witnessing how their absolute magnificence was not translating because of all the shoulds in their head, because of the voices going on in there saying, here's how you're supposed to sound if you're a public figure. Here's how you're supposed to show up in public. Here's how you're supposed to get taken seriously. And I was so aware both of the heartbreak of that disconnect and also of like what this cultural story is. If any of you Google, how do I sound more authoritative, which like clearly people have done because you Google it and it's like this little prepared 5 bullet points that come up. One of them is look confident. How do I sound more authoritative? You look, apparently. It's nothing to do with sound, right? You look confident. But all the other ones are voice related. And they all are like, go down at the end of your sentence instead of up. Put a lot of emphasis in your words and keep the pitch of your voice low. So for anyone who's worried that their pitch is too high, that they sound too young, that they sound like a woman, if you have those shoulds in your head, those worries, it's because you've picked up the story that society's been putting down, right? It's Googleable. Not that we've Googled, not that we've needed to, quite frankly. And all of this really came to a head after I coached those women. And I was like, I think people speaking in public in fresh ways and owning it is my business.
I mean, I feel like in our class yesterday, we had so many of these kind of like mic drop moments. And that was for me a mic drop moment, this revelation that this kind of aha moment that you had, Samara. And
I mean, it was connected. I'll tell, there's a tiny little second half of that, because that's almost like the setup without the, but that same summer, I came back from DC and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was coming through LA. And she had just won the primary, but she wasn't yet a congressperson. But, I had enough New York friends that I'd heard about her. And I thought, maybe I should go check this woman out in person. She was like speaking at a church in Koreatown in LA. And as I was driving to go to listen to her, I called my mom and I told her what I was doing. And my mom said, and this is like, she hates the story. And my mom said, "Oh, thank God she needs you." I mean, listen, bless. Obviously, my mom is my biggest fan, and I adore her. But I said, "No, I think she's doing just fine without me." And my mom doubled down and said, "No, I can't take her seriously with that voice." And my mom is a feminist. She was one of the 5 women in a class of hundreds at Michigan Law. But she couldn't take her seriously with that voice. And I had this spark when she said that, and I said out loud without even thinking, or she's teaching us what getting taken seriously might sound like.
I mean, something that you talk about so much in the book, you talk, for example, I think in the chapter on pitch. And so you all know there are chapters devoted to breath and size and emotion and tone and sounds and the words that we choose. There's a wonderful chapter, I think it's in the chapter on pitch, where you talk about upspeak and vocal fry and how these are two different kind of sounds that often get coded as strangely feminine. I say strangely because men speak with upspeak and vocal fry too, but nobody clocks them on that. I'm speaking with a lot of vocal fry here myself in this conversation, I should say. And I wonder if you talk about that. Like, that's part of the story, that women speak with this kind of fried way of speaking, and men somehow don't. I mean, a point that you make in the book, I think really convincingly, is that there is no standard speech. There is no one good American English speech. But somehow, why is it that women get stuck with this kind of sense? Women speak with this kind of fried way, and they end their sentences as though they were questions. I mean, would you say just a little bit about that, and also about how sometimes it's perfectly fine to use, it should be perfectly fine to speak in a fried kind of way. And it's about knowing the difference and knowing how to code switch between the two circumstances.
I mean, there's so much in this question, but yeah, what I'm going to pull out first off is that, as you all saw from how many different departments signed on to this is really interdisciplinary work. How we use our voice in public intersects with, of course, performance theory and art. I have an MFA in acting, but also psychology and cultural history, the history of public spaces, literal spaces that were built, that we step into, were literally made for who they were built with in mind. And another thread is linguistics. So the sociolinguists would say, in response to what you're bringing up, this extremely generous gift, this just moving gift, which is every habit vocally any of us have picked up, whether it's an accent we got from our parents, whether it's interrupting or never interrupting, or speaking loudly or speaking quietly, or what each of you do when you're uncomfortable, right? Do you get louder? Do you get quieter? Do you get more fanciful with your language? Do you get simpler, right? All of the habits any of us have ever picked up, we have picked up for a reason. They have worked in certain rooms. When we were 2, to make the people who cared for us turn toward us instead of away from us. When we were 10 and we were navigating weird friend dynamics. When we were 16 and dating that person for the first time and trying to sound more like them or less like them, and more like that girl that we thought was really cool at school or less like that girl, right? The micro adjustments each of us have made, both in the moment and then also the ones that have become habit, have led to the version of us that exists today, who left home, who went to that school, who made those choices, who got by in those rooms, who decided that being liked was in fact a form of power, so I'm going to go for it, who decided tough was in fact a form of power. So I'm going to go for it. I'm going to try to seem intimidating. I'm going to try to seem unintimidating. I'm right. Like each of these individual choices we made are survival choices, right? Or if that feels too dramatic, they're just like we live in a civil society. Like how do you through it? And this is what's so like gorgeous and deep and huge and like ultimately kind of healing about this work that I came upon and didn't realize what I was really doing. Because, you know, I just named it our voice story. We all know there's like, we have a money story. We have, you know, whatever. We have like, we each have connections to these sort of concepts and the collections of half-truths or myths or, you know, observations we've made. And the same is the case with the voice and how we listen to other people's and how we listen to our own. And we just don't have enough spaces to talk about it. And, you know, voices are invisible.
It's just even how you're talking about it's amazing because you're making me think another department we could have approached for co-sponsorship would have been psychology, just because there's a whole psychological dimension here as well. The story of our voices are the stories, as you're saying, are the stories of our lives and all of the different histories that we've kind of had to live through and adjustments we've had to make. And you tell a story in the last section of your book that a number of my students really struck them. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about it now. It's about Carol Gilligan's research with young teen and tween-age girls and the kind of strange silencing that happens in their voices as they're growing into their maturity so that they can learn to be a good girl. And that story just broke my heart reading it. And also I felt like I, at some level, also kind of understood what it meant for in my own life as well. Yeah. And so part of what I think that you're doing in this book is really getting us to think that there are ways in which we've been made to feel about our voices that we need to kind of unlearn. There's a lot of vocal shame that comes with speaking in public that is very effective at making sure that we keep ourselves quiet. And I wonder if you maybe, I don't know, maybe would you say just a little bit about that Carol Gilligan research and then maybe you could riff on what you're thinking about with that now.
Yeah, that's so real. It's so real. You know, this all started, another version of the origin story is it started because I lost my voice in my early 20s. And it was this multi-month experience and I wasn't sick and I couldn't figure it out, but it was so painful that I stopped talking. And I, you know, Joe knows I talk about this in the introduction, but the reason I tell this is not because it was like that traumatic in and of itself. It was a weird moment. I ultimately went to a speech pathologist and relearned how to talk. And she was lovely. And I went back and interviewed her for this book, which was a true delight. God bless my mom. Again, my mom who remembered her first name. And so I just like Googled all till I could figure her out. But I tell the story for a different reason, which is that the day that I got the diagnosis, that what had been happening in my throat was vocal nodules. For anybody, I'd love to hear from anybody in the question if this is something that's affected you as well. But vocal nodules, your vocal cords blister same place, both sides, telltale sign. And the day that I got this diagnosis, I had missed my morning in class. I was in grad school, and I got back to class. And the guy who ran the whole acting program stopped everything. And in front of everyone, he said, "So, what's the diagnosis?" Bless. And I said, as audibly as I could through this like deeply painful throat, vocal nodules, I have to go on vocal rest. Like vocal rest. And he said, yeah, just as I thought, bad usage. Which is, so, I mean, just to name it, it's such a weird phrase. It's not like something we normally say, but I got it in that moment. You got it listening, right? He was like throwing this shame ball at me. Yeah, I see you're injured, but you did it to yourself.
Victim blaming, yeah, in a way.
Truly. And I didn't have the tools to understand that at the time. I just was like, why did I self-sabotage? Why did I do this to myself? Where did I pick up this bad usage? And to turn it, to connect it back to the sociolinguist's gift to us, why would I pick up a habit that would ultimately silence me? And although I went to that speech pathologist and everything was solved within a month or two, that part wasn't. And it actually took me until, I have to admit, I met a lit agent, I pitched this book, I got this incredible book deal after a 13-way bidding war. I wrote the whole thing over the 1.5 years of my contract. The very end, I wrote the introduction. And only then was I like, oh my God, this is the book I needed. This is what I needed when I was in my early 20s. And I was like, Why would I, somebody who thinks of herself as self-possessed, do this to myself? And I obviously share all this because you mentioned the concept of shame, and it really does run deep in these weird, surprising ways. It's a comment from somebody in second grade that stuck with us. Your laugh is annoying. Do you try to sound stupid on purpose? Somebody told me. Not to me, but that was what she was. She had a high school English teacher who told her that. And she is a executive in Hollywood. And she tells me every time she opens her mouth, she thinks to herself, do they also think that I'm trying to sound stupid on purpose? These tiny comments. And then there's the added thing, which is the shame of why did I let this comment get to me? So to tie it into Carol Gilligan, in your question, she's this brilliant woman who like sat at the cross section. She's still technically, I could not get a hold of her. She's in her elder years. But she sits at the cross section of psychology and linguistics, and she would, and ethics. And she would ask these young girls these questions. If somebody stole a loaf of bread because their family was, it wasn't exactly the Les Mis setup, but it was basically the Les Mis setup. And then she would listen to them. She would record them and listen to them over many years before puberty and during. And she noticed on just like the most basic linguistic level, when they, and I say they because it just happened across the board, when they went from, well, I know this, and I know this, and I know I would do this, to I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, I don't. And she calls it their initiation into patriarchy. And obviously boys have theirs. As she puts it, it tends to happen younger in the 5-6 range when they're realizing whether or not they're allowed to be emotionally available. And we know what happens there. I'm raising a boy, so I think about this a lot. But also it's not necessarily gendered, right? I mean, certainly there is just like a spectrum, and there's a spectrum of experience. And this idea of, I'm going to hide how I truly feel because relationships matter more. Many of us know. And then the habit of that becomes, I don't actually know how I feel. I don't actually know what I want. Do I want anything? How would I know? And then the losing of your own story. I don't even know what happened.
Well, and also then I feel like women get subjected to a certain kind of double bind. Women in a number of marginalized backgrounds, people from a number of marginalized backgrounds can get subjected to this double bind of, oh, well, then if you do try to speak authentically from what you're actually feeling, then there's this, oh, well, you're just being emotional. You're being too emotional. And the emotion's showing up in how rangy your voice is becoming or how loud you're becoming, And so there's a way in which there's that sense of self-questioning just gets reinforced even at the level of what you're even feeling.
Well, and yeah, I mean, people get penalized, right? So it's not even just like, we're our own worst enemy. Sometimes we're not our own worst enemy. The listeners are our worst enemy. And in fact, a question just came in. I saw.
Should we start to feed some of them?
Sure. I don't know.
Yeah, let's try to make it as organic as we can. Sure. So this is a question from the audience. Let's just start turning to them. You can start sending them in, and Jessica and Chris will start to kind of filter them up towards us. Let's see. So here's one. How would you accentuate your content differently if you were speaking to a group of men or a woman speaking to a group? Sorry, I misread this. How would you accentuate your content differently if you were a woman speaking to a group of men or a woman speaking to a group of women or a balanced group of women and men? I mean, maybe a prior question would be, Samara, would you modulate your content differently, accentuate it differently? Or would you try to speak in the same way to different kinds of audiences of different gender makeups?
There's a lot of different answers to this question, and it's actually quite personal. So I'm not going to answer, just to be clear for all of you, it's not like I'm going to be like, there's a right answer. In fact, I think that there's a right answer, like self-help industrial complex is probably part of the problem. But I will say this. Do any of us speak to a 2-year-old the same way we speak to a lawyer who's calling with a legal issue? Do any of us speak to a grandmother who's stumbling the same way we do to a grandmother who's yelling at us? I think it's lovely to ask these big questions and to reckon with them, and also to not lose our humanity inside of it. And part of what I mean by that is not just our humanity, like being a kind human or being an emotional human, both of which I do mean, but also an incredible thing about humans is that we are constantly listening to the room we're in and making adjustments accordingly. And we can either think of that as a flaw, there's one authentic us and all the rest are fake, or we can think of it as a real celebration of humanity. Why don't we talk to a 2-year-old the same way as we talk to a lawyer who's got something scary to say on the phone? Well, we must have the ability to make a billion minute adjustments. Why don't we love on that instead of call it a problem? So with that in mind, thinking about the exact room that you're going to speak in, not a generic room with a gender breakdown. I think it's more interesting even to ask, per this question about the gender breakdown, age, politics, open-mindedness versus closed-mindedness, what you know about this group in advance, how much they're open to your cause, right? These questions, I think, are these sort of psychographics are even more important in terms of how you're going to show up. But the answer is some juicy dance of, I'm going to show up as the version of me that centers my own mischief and delight and gets my point across and cares out loud as much as I possibly can, because I know that even though that's not what Google says is the top 5 ways to get taken seriously, I know from my lived experience, both speaking and listening, and we all know this actually, that when we show up like a whole human is when we make an impact. So it's a combination of that. It was mentioned that I have the Substack, How to Show Up. I'm really interested in how to create the conditions for each of us to really show up when we have these high stakes opportunities to talk about what's close to our heart. It's that combined with listening in the room. What's working, what's not working? What do the people need? Are we just there to hear ourselves talk? Likely not. What do they need?
Yeah, and also just as you said, kind of observing what's the specific situation, what's the context here, it's not only knowing your audience, but knowing what people need from you at a given moment. Something I was thinking about during your comments yesterday in the class, going back to the kind of Upspeak and vocal fry question, and the sense of knowing when might it be important or when might it be okay, even desirable to use Upspeak or vocal fry. Like when two friends are talking on the phone, you're trying to indicate that you're comfortable, you're trying to indicate that you're relaxed. I think something that a lot of my students right now are wondering about is why is my kind of private voice when I'm talking with my friends at the dining hall different than the public voice? The public voice is the performative voice, the standard voice.
I have thoughts about this.
Yes, and there is a kind of a gray area, or there's becoming more of a gray area, and maybe it's okay for us to kind of gray that area. Something actually you say in the book, and one of my students posted this on our class discussions website, and they said, Samara writes, but big public presentations, or even the kind of private conversations where the stakes are high, the ideas are consequential, things are just different. The difference is that it's not a jam session anymore. You don't have to share the floor. In fact, you shouldn't. So I think also something I'm hearing you say is knowing in the room, is it my chance? Is it my turn to claim space, to take space, to have the spotlight? Sometimes you want it to be a kind of a jam session, and you want it to feel like there's a kind of symbiosis between you as the speaker and the audiences as the listener. But also sometimes this is your moment where you're not supposed to share the floor. And in fact, you shouldn't. Take your space.
And if there's a version of us that knows how to talk to a 2-year-old and to a lawyer, there's also actually versions of ourselves that know how to do those two things. It's just that we're maybe not as practiced in them, or we're not as practiced in trusting that we're right, that we are right for that moment. Right. And this is a beautiful distinction, what you just said. So listen, there's no official line between public and private. This is part of what's, I think, thrilling and curiosity inducing, and also sort of terrifying about this idea of public speaking, leaving our home to enter the public sphere or the public arena. Well, what are we doing right now? I'm not leaving my home. Have you? I mean, you're actually at work. I'm not. But this feels public. So I live in the gray areas. I don't mind it. It's a tolerance that you build up, right? But there is something about this sort of metaphor of the jam session, of how we sound when we're interacting, and when what we're saying is not only the words we're saying, but also we're collaborating. We're saying that. Upspeak and vocal fry, in a way, are saying without saying we're collaborating. So upspeak goes up at the end of the sentence. So you say, this is what I think. But that actually means this is what I think. And also I'm opening it. What do you think? Instead of this is what I think, which we all hear that. And we're like, oh, that's closed for debate. So there's ways in which vocally we are saying, you know, we're in the middle of a collaborative making of a single conversation versus these public speaking moments where we really are taking the floor. And for that, most of us, many of us, are less practiced, less comfortable, and where all of our dormant stories from our own life as well as from our culture wake up and start to get in the way of us showing up with a true internal body felt sense of permission, which is why, you know, the book is called Permission to Speak. And I had a conversation with my publisher and I was like, if you're going to just go typography, this is where we were heading because there's like no good image. I was like, please don't do a standalone mouth. It's the literal opposite of the meaning of my book. I was like, if we're going to just do typography, the word permission matters more than speak. And then they gave me this version of the book that has 6 permissions before you get to the speak. And I was like, correct.
I also love the acid pink on the last permission. Speaking of my own book has an acid pink word on it. I saw yours and thought, oh, acid pink. I love it.
Listen, a little Baroque goes a long way.
Okay.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
We have another question. Maybe we should turn to this question.
Yes, but wait. Sorry. So I got distracted, but I wanted to say one more thing about this public-private thing because I think it's useful. And it may tie into that question, actually. I have found for myself, and this is, you know, I found for myself, meaning like this is the lived experience version rather than the book learning version. But I think it matters that I lost my train of thought. I'm going to just be totally honest about it. No, okay, I found it. Okay. Oh my gosh, you guys. Okay, here's what I was going to say. The version of me that speaks in private and the version of me that speaks in public are connected. They're both me. They're versions of me. But there is a distinction I have found. And I found this when a journalist started interviewing me over Zoom. And we had a little chat. And then she hit record. So we did that like, you know, moment where nothing changed except that we knew that we were suddenly on the record. And her first question, however I answered it, I don't remember, she interrupted right away and she said, interesting. You sound a little different than you did a few minutes ago. And I could tell it was a gotcha moment, right? But I also was like, ooh, my mischief. Fortunately, my like mischief hat came on. And I was like, okay, I'm going to push back. I might sound different in private and public. This is okay, right? We're going to eradicate shame where we find it. This is okay. But I think it's more interesting than like real me, fake me. I think that public me just has a little heightened sense of responsibility. I think that's what it is. I think that's what you're hearing in my voice. I am more thoughtful in what I say in public because I know I'm on a mission. You know, I know that everything that I say matters. And even me messing up, you know, like that moment a minute ago, that is modeling. We are modeling that there are new ways to show up in public. And that honestly, the people who are afraid to allow surprise in, we don't actually connect with as listeners as well. We love when people are real. And then we talk ourselves out of it when we have the chance to speak. We try to sound as polished as possible, as slick as possible, for all kinds of understandable reasons having to do with the fear of, you know, retribution of some sort. Like, well, we can't take her seriously.
I have so many thoughts in response to all of this, you know, especially the idea of, you know, the kind of phobia of code switching as a kind of, or the kind of anxieties that code switching raise, you know, in certain kinds of speakers or certain kind of listeners, the idea that this is maybe a real voice and this is possibly a fake voice because there's multiple voices going on here, as though that weren't something that everyone in fact does.
Completely. So, and just to name it, you know, code switching, there's 2 really different uses of this term. One of them is in the Black community and one of them is linguistically. And linguists will say we all code switch. It means that we're reading the room and making adjustments accordingly. And then obviously in the Black community, there is this more loaded aspect to it because code switching either happens because we're reading a room and we're like, ooh, I want to be a them, not an us. Or it happens for safety. And those feel real different on the inside. Right. And one of them erodes the spirit and one of them perhaps doesn't.
Right. I think that there's ultimately, though, the idea that there's like one authentic way of speaking, one authentic voice that doesn't engage in this kind of transformative behavior performative behavior, you might
It
say.
sets us up to fail.
Yeah, it does, and it's very old. I mean, it goes. The students in the public speech class, they've been reading Plato's writings on rhetoric, and Plato was very anxious about the theater as a scene of dissimulation, deception, illusion. He was very anxious about rhetoric as just only being able to kind of create persuasion and not actually lead you to knowledge. And there's a very old, I think, kind of Platonic anxiety about performance, anxiety about the body, anxiety about seeming, about he compares rhetoric to cosmetics. I mean, it's very gendered. So this is like, it goes way, way, way back. And I don't know, you're making me think about all of these things, but that's just to say, I'm so eager to kind of like talk with you too, but I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that we've got a question in the chat. Maybe I should just turn to that. I want to make sure we get to some of these.
I love that phrase, like anxiety about seeming.
Oh yeah. Oh,
it's so real for anyone listening. Like, let's just sit with that. Like, that's so real. We're just, I was more afraid when I was relearning how to talk. It turns out the habit I had picked up was speaking a little tiny bit below my body's optimum pitch. It wasn't dramatic, right? It wasn't like Elizabeth Holmes, bless, but it was enough that it caught up to me. And relearning how to talk meant that I had to learn how to talk a teeny, teeny, teeny bit higher. And I was listening back to myself and having like the sort of ego jostle of like, she sounds like a ditz, that person who talks higher. And what I was more afraid of than seeming like a ditz was seeming like a fraud.
Seeming.
I remember the anxiety of seeming.
Yeah. And I think some people get to feel it more than others. Some people feel that shame about like, oh, there's this imposter situation going on here. And for other people, it's just, I don't know, there's an unequal distribution of those kinds of shames. I think you might
yes. I mean, just to say, this book is very much a social justice book because inevitably that has to be front and center, or else what are we talking about?
So let me turn to this question.
Yes.
This looks like a great question. I teach public speaking in high school, 11th and 12th grades at an independent school here in New York City. Yes, New York City. And I'm wondering what the top 3 or 4 things you would say are the most important things to keep in mind when you're standing and speaking before a live audience. The top 3 or 4 things that seem most important for you to keep in mind.
Okay, I'm gonna see what comes out of my mouth. Thing number 1. This is perhaps a surprising one, but there's a reason that I started my book where I did with the introduction in chapter 1, which is technically all breath, but it is sort of a Trojan horse for actually how we hold our breath in spaces that don't feel comfortable. And so the first thing that I would really emphasize, especially for students, that we really got to sort of, dig into yesterday with the undergrads, is if there is sort of a standard of how people have historically been told to speak in public, that Google reference encapsulates, but so does, the 2,000-year-old texts. If there is, let's lovingly call it the old sound of power, and we can name, 20 tall, straight, white men of means who talk that way, and nothing wrong with them. They just maybe lucked out. And we think like, wow, it's really easy for Stephen Colbert. It's really easy for Tom Hanks. Like, I'm sure things are hard for them, for sure. I'm a humanist, like for sure. But talking in public like a person whose ideas deserve to be heard, maybe not, right? If that's the old sound of power, bless, lovingly, then what is the new sound of power that doesn't follow those rules, and yet, as I said earlier, makes an incredible impact? And so it's obviously not just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? We can start to think, well, who do we listen to? What kind of podcast do we like to have in this, intimate spot inside of our own ear? What are the TikTokers or the YouTubers or the Instagrammers who, when they show up, your body goes, ooh, you physically feel the urge to share their tips or those that you don't, right? The person who nervously stands up at the town hall, the artist who wins that award and says something in their speech that just transcends the moment. And we start to notice those. And what we notice is that there is this new sound of power, and that it is inevitably diverse. It is inevitably not one way. There are foreign accents. There are accents that code for, you know, a region rather than a non-region. There's an emotional availability that the old story says is dangerous. And now here we are leaning in instead of leaning out when we hear it. So I say all of this to say that I think the number one thing for any student dealing with public speaking these days is to just try on for size, I am the new sound of power. And inside of that is this question of what kind of leader they'd like to see more of in the world, how that kind of dream leader sounds, talks, seems, comes across, and how they might embody those values themselves when they get the chance to speak. So then all the other stuff, you know, you said 3 or 4, right? All the other stuff, it kind of comes out of that. So what feels good in the body? What feels like you're taking up space? How do you invite yourself in? How do you do a warm-up that's like physical meets vocal meets spirit? Like, you know, I offered this yesterday. I think this is the kind of thing that seems on the surface like a nice to have, but actually is sort of essential. If you are about to go out and speak, and if these kids are about to go out and speak, what do you do in the moment before? Okay, there's the physical and there's the vocal, but then there is like this moment where you tap into something where you don't. And often we spend that moment, if we haven't gotten intentional about it, worst case scenarioizing, right? On some level, I hope I don't get it wrong. I hope I don't F up. I hope they don't laugh at me. I hope they don't kick me out of the tribe, right? This is like foundational human survival stuff. It's also fear-based. It's learned, right? And so we intentionally have a more generative thought right before. We bring to mind, and this is something you can do in advance, right? We bring to mind a memory or two of a time that someone really saw us, that we really felt a sense of what social psychologists call personal power, not power over, but power to, agency. We felt really seen. We felt like our contribution really mattered to somebody. Maybe it was just a hug or a text or an email, or we heard it through the grapevine, right? But collect a few of those. And if your mind is blank right now, like, be gentle with yourself and allow them to come, right? I shared one yesterday that my first big talk out of the pandemic in a real room was obviously nerve-wracking on some level. I was like, I'm an expert in public speaking and I haven't done it for years. You know, let's see what this is. And it went really well. It was quite gratifying. And this woman in the back of the room told me, you held my heart in your hands. And she happened to be a professor at the university. And I was like really an admirer of hers. And like, it's that kind of memory that we get to just decide in the moments before we're going to go out on stage and speak, especially when it feels like the stakes are high and our body's starting to tell us that we're nervous. We get to connect to, yeah, I'm also powerful. I'm also powerful. And then, you know, I would say the last thing is to make it about your audience. So that is, of course, like pouring into yourself, but then not at the expense of them and them not at the expense of you. And there's this interesting kind of tension there. But how are the people who are listening part of the story that you're about to tell? Like, we had an example yesterday with a student who gave me a little snippet of his work on jazz. And I gave him a little note of decide. Let's just decide. Use your imagination and decide that you're speaking to a room full of jazz enthusiasts. They get it. They get it. This is not you having to convince them. They get it. And his entire demeanor changed. You know, I like to joke that but it's not a joke, that there's like 2 ways that all of us know how to be in the world. It is a joke because, of course, as we've just discussed, there's 80 billion. But I think they might fit into 2 big categories. One is how we are in what linguists would call an evaluative space. So this is a space where we're literally being evaluated, like a job interview, but also, you know, the messier ones where we can tell they're still reading us. They're still trying to decide whether to take us seriously, right? There's like a prove yourself vibe. And then there's what we're like when we don't feel that. And we have nothing to prove when we're with our favorite people. And that is actually a line that I think is perhaps more interesting than the public-private one, because how do we expand just a little bit that the schemas that we feel like, I don't have anything to prove. No, I'm just here to connect to them, give them what I possibly can, connect to me, to my spirit, bring a little mischief in, have a good time, even if we're talking about hard things, and surprise ourselves.
I also love, I'm just going to say, I want to throw this in there so that the audience gets it as well. Samara in Permission to Speak cites, is it Eliza Hogue? I don't know if I'm ever pronouncing it. Elise Hogue, who says that, who recommends that you have to be proud of your life. You have to be proud of your life. You have to love your life. I mean, when we talk about the voice being an index of all the past history that you've lived through and all of the things you've overcome and survived and been subjected to and all of that, I mean, that's also like where the book really gets properly like this is a book that's deeply psychological, and that is like a psychological pathway that could last a person a whole life. In many cases, does last a person a whole life long.
I told the group yesterday very transparently, and I'll say it to you. I wrote a letter to Oprah. She hasn't responded yet, but if anybody knows her, feel free to give her a little nudge. You know, we're like part of the same like larger public. My book publisher is Penguin Random House, so you know, like it is possible that it'll get to her, but you know, she's got a long list of stuff to get through. But I did tell her in that letter, first of all, I thanked her for being an example of the new sound of power, such a magnificent model for us, but also that this project of self-love, however we want to call it, right? If that feels too frou-frou, right? Whatever your term is, but this project of really accepting ourselves, the life we've actually lived, the stuff that was on purpose and the stuff that happened to us, the stuff we regret, the stuff we're proud of, right? If we own all those parts, this project of self-love, it really hits the fan when we talk in public. This is why I care about public speaking. Because when we really love on ourselves, even in those moments, that's when those ideas from the inside come out and impact the people and impact our destiny and is, you know, as we said yesterday, legacy work, but also like reshapes the world. We need some world reshaping right now.
So just to pivot from like the big picture of like self-love, self-affirmation, and the political of that, of more of us in the world reshaping the sound of power. Now, here's a very practical question.
Love it.
This question is asking, in your journey, were you required to take a period of vocal rest for your nodules? Yeah, Samara did mention that, it sounds like. If vocal rest is prescribed and you still have to meet speaking engagements, perform roles, or sing, how would you negotiate those engagements without experiencing vocal shaming, is this questioner's question.
Well, if you're going to do vocal rest, you do vocal rest. And if you're not, you don't. But, you know, I think inside of this question is actually a question about self-care, not to be cliche, but, you know, there are certain communities and sub-communities in all of our lives that really understand the moment we're in terms of rest, in terms of questioning productivity, and, you know, the way that capitalism makes us all want to feel like machines who don't need to rest, and then how our bodies remind us otherwise. And there's like a whole pandemic, you know, narrative inside of that. If we're medically told to take a real rest, that's when we do it.
And then
if you're forced otherwise, then I'm really angry on your behalf. But if you're forcing yourself, that is definitely a place for inquiry.
And then how do you, maybe I also hear in this question, how do you, what recommendations maybe, Samara, might you have for like actually dealing with the emotion of that, the emotion of having to cancel those engagements, or say, let's postpone them by a year, or, I mean, there's a whole emotional quality.
It's grief is what it is. Yeah. And I mean, I'm always like grateful when people say that about stuff that isn't like literal death. But, you know, death of expectations, death of hopes, these matter. These matter. It was a very weird time when I went on vocal rest for that. Like, it was over a month. It was a month and a half. And of course, there was little words that came out of my mouth here and there. But for the most part, I was writing, and I was like, you know, having inner monologue. And I remember not only did I drop out of the play where I finally got my first good role. I mean, like, this is so, you know, like the irony is so obvious. I don't even mention those parts, but like, and I stopped singing, and you know, not only that, but I remember there was a part before before winter break where I really was on like true vocal rest with just my family. There was this era when I got the diagnosis and was on proper vocal rest where I would go to class anyway, because, you know, I was in grad school. You don't not go to class just because you can't talk. But boy, did I notice how differently people treated me. You all can tell I'm a talker. So suddenly I wasn't, and I was treated like a literal ghost. No one noticed if I was in the room or not. And this isn't personal. I'm not saying, but this is the dynamic. So yeah, I mean, just holding space for it's going to be weird, but so is any recovery. My Substack today, I was just talking about how I've just had a number of friends with cancer diagnoses and MS and a lot just in the last 2 months. Maybe it's that we're in our 40s. I don't know. But just there's, I don't need to, I'm not an expert in what I'm about to say. We're equally experts. But when we're hurt, we stop or we don't, and we stay hurt.
Yeah, that quality of being patient and gentle with yourself sounds so important in that circumstance.
And it's hard, and our culture is not set up to support that in any way, and we might lose wages. And here we are. And I'll bring this in because it's a tiny bit more optimistic than what I just said. I am always really, really interested in this idea of leadership with a lowercase L, by which I mean the ways that in our own lives, whether we have a titled position or not, we make choices to do the little brave thing. And sometimes this is giving our friend sound advice if we can tell that they're falling into a trap, right? Sometimes it's speaking up for ourselves and saying, I actually can't make a decision on this thing. I need a second meeting, even though that was not offered, right? I mean, these show up in all kinds of different ways. But for myself, that reframing a tough moment as leadership really grants me a fresh kind of permission. I'm going to stay home and sleep tonight, and it's going to look like the opposite of anything glamorous in any way. But you know what? It's leadership. And I'm actually going to text my friend and say, I can't come because I'm getting sick. I can tell, and I'm going to put myself to bed instead. And now I'm modeling leadership, right? And then they go, I'm so glad you're taking care of yourself. And here we are, reaffirming that this new way where we notice our bodies and decide that they matter is something we're doing in community instead of solo, right?
Yeah, and then the kind of boundary between those leadership with a lowercase L and then leadership with a capital L, that can be blurred too, I see there's one last question, and then I wanted to ask you a last thing. This last question is very brief and maybe kind of open-ended, so maybe take it where you want. Then I wanted to ask you a last thing before we ended our session. I see we just only have a few more minutes left. The question is, how does listening play a role? How does listening play a role? It's very open-ended, so take it where you want, Samara.
The book is half about talking and half about listening. I rarely discuss it in these terms, but any of our entry points into this idea of public speaking, any of them, whether we think of ourselves as a serious introvert who's never spoken in public and doesn't want to, and fear, right? Or the most confident person out there who's well, this wasn't really for me. All of us have work. All of us have work if we'd like to build a better world. And listening is part of it. And, I introduced the idea not just of accent bias, which is really common in linguistic writing, but voice bias. So that we're including not just, vowel and consonant sounds that code for elsewhere, but also things like upspeak and vocal fry and word choice, fragmented sentences versus full paragraphs, the different ways that we talk, the different ways we have been trained to talk based on the rooms we've been in. And how we listen to those, and how we accidentally categorize people. Oh, they're not to be listened to. Oh, I need someone else. I can't understand them. And with great love, as we attempt to confront all of our biases, we just go, well, they're going to exist. This is what brains do. But we do get to have control over the second wiser thought. So if I think, oh, that person's not a me person, that person is, I can notice that and I can go, how interesting. What did my brain try to do right there? Right? There's this lovely psychologist who wrote a book called How You Say It, who says that separate any common group by a mountain range, and they create different ways of speaking quickly. So we're constantly mountain ranging people. Oh, they're my side of the mountain. And many, many of us also have as a value that we want to respect humans, that we care about diversity, right? And so our values and our biases are not in alignment. And we get to write that by noticing and having, as I like to put it, more generous ears And this also specifically comes up when it comes to leadership, right? If you have power in an institution and there's somebody who talks in a way that just does not code for leadership, you can give them some feedback. You can give them a copy of my book, because it may be that that person has habits that they're ready to let go of, to step into more of their power. But it also may be that they embody the sound of where power is going, what leadership and authority might sound like in the future. Maybe they just sound more perky than you're used to, or softer, or sillier, or they swear a little bit, right? Just things that just, if we're narrowly defining what leadership tends to sound like, they're outside of it. But as we begin to expand it, they're not.
And you're also just modeling for us how to take joy in and how to affirm other people's difference and the different life stories that we can hear in the voices of people who speak to us.
Our
Like,
voice tells our life experience.
what are you hearing when you hear someone's different voice? There's something actually really, I think, marvelous about that. My last question for you, Samara, is if you talk just a little bit about authenticity, because you have this definition in the book that I love and that I read aloud to the students in class, and it stayed with me, and I've quoted it to a few other friends as well. I mean, authenticity was Merriam-Webster's word of the year 2023. There's a lot of anxiety and
I didn't even know that.
and fascination about authenticity. Like, what's authentic? Is this a real AI? Is this a real picture or AI? Is this influencer a real person, or are they a fake? Like, there's a sense.
Well, and it connects into your anxiety about seeming,
and can we trust are the results of this election real or authentic? Is this a real story or conspiracy theory? There's so much anxiety about what's authentic, and I also think there's, like the philosopher Theodor Adorno warned that in cultures or in societies where there's an overemphasis on the authentic, one should be wary about the rise of fascism, because there's always this emphasis on who are the authentic Germans, Americans, who are the real Americans right now. I think there's a lot going on in the culture, but the way you define authenticity in this book, you say that you define it not as something that you are, but as something that you do and that you can do. In that you say that it means to be authentic is to reveal what matters to you, like it matters to you, and that has really stayed with me. That authenticity is a matter of revealing what matters to you, like it matters to you, like to actually honestly care about it. Do you want to say something about that as a last?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's as a coach, I am fundamentally a coach, and so I'm always interested in what works, right? The true pragmatics, and this to me is freeing, so that we're not going around judging people. Are they authentic? Aren't they? Right? We can love on people. We all show up in weird moments in weird ways. We're all dealing with, as we know, stories we don't know anything about. But we can take responsibility for ourselves, and we can work on this thing that I call caring out loud, which you all have seen me do today. I mean, I've deliberately shown up as authentically as I can with my dear friend Joe, who I did Sweeney Todd with in college.
That's right.
And it's an interesting conundrum for most of us. This idea of talking about what we care about, like we care about it. The like we care about it is the hard part. We can decide, okay, I'm going to tell everybody I have this pitch of a weird idea. But do we do it where we actually make it clear that we care about it? Because suddenly that makes us much more vulnerable. Now it is clear it costs us something. That is also, however, the only way to truly connect. So the question is, do you habitually undercare when you're talking about something you care about? These incredible, completely understandable, like risk management tools we've all picked up, so that we can say, for example, I care a lot about this, but I mean, like, whatever, right? Vocal fry, fabulously useful for that. Or do we habitually do the opposite and overcare? So we're not totally comfortable saying, here's what matters to me. We worry we're not doing enough. Perhaps we worked in customer service, or we were socialized female, and we go, this really matters to me. Do you guys like me enough? Right? Let me push it more. Also completely learned behavior. But on the one hand, under-caring, seeming that we're under-caring, and on the other hand, seeming that we're over-caring, are both forms of hiding. They're both ways of not totally trusting that us just saying, I care about this, is enough, is the right amount. But as we practice that sweet spot in the middle, we find authenticity. We just find it. And it inevitably comes with a little bit more of an emotional hit. And it also inevitably comes with just a possibility of joy. of something that feels like we are in ourself. We are in alignment.
I think that sounds like a great place to stop. We're out of time, but thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Samara, for coming to speak, both at Skidmore and to this larger alumni community. It's so great to have you.
My absolute pleasure. I love that I got to do this. I love that I got to do this with you. And for those of you who are curious, obviously feel free to buy my book, audiobook. I recommend. It's my voice. But also come and find me on Substack. It's free, and it's called How to Show Up. And I've been writing a weekly post there. So if this has been interesting, it keeps getting more interesting.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. And thanks again to the Advancement Office for hosting us today.
Thank you.
Bye.